The ring hit the marble floor with a sound so small it should have meant nothing. Tessa Burnham heard it anyway. She always heard the small things. That was the job. 12 years of housekeeping at the Ashford Grand in Toronto had trained her ears to notice what other people walked past. A dripping tap behind a closed door, a wine glass left too close to a table edge, a guest who said fine in the voice that meant anything but. She set down her cart, crouched beside the luggage rack in Suite 1408, and picked up the ring. It was old, that much was obvious. The gold had that particular warmth that only comes from decades of being worn, the kind that no jeweler can replicate from scratch. A single oval stone, dark green, set simply, no flourishes. On the inside of the band, 2 words in faded script, always yours. Tessa turned it over in her palm. She should have set it on the nightstand. That was protocol. Lost items went to the nightstand, then to the front desk if unclaimed by checkout. She set it on the nightstand. Then she looked at the room. Suite 1408 had been occupied by 1 guest for 6 days. No name on the housekeeping sheet, just a room number and a note that read, "Do not disturb before noon. Extra towels only," which was unusual for a suite that billed at $4,000 a night. Most guests at that rate wanted turn-down service, fresh orchids, a handwritten card from management. This guest wanted towels and to be left alone. Tessa straightened the pillows, replaced the toiletries, collected the 2 empty coffee cups from the windowsill. Outside, Lake Ontario was gray and flat under an October sky. She paused there for a moment, the way she always did in the lake-facing rooms. 12 years, and she still paused. She was still at the window when the door opened. The man who walked in stopped when he saw her. He was younger than she expected for someone staying in a suite like this. Early 30s, maybe. Dark coat, no tie, the kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep. He had a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and he looked at Tessa the way people sometimes looked at housekeeping staff. Not unkindly, exactly, but like furniture that had rearranged itself unexpectedly. "I didn't ask for turn-down," he said. "It's 11:50, sir," Tessa replied. "Turn-down starts at noon. I'm just finishing up." She gestured to her cart near the door. "I'll be out of your way." He nodded and moved to the desk, setting down his coffee, scrolling through something on his phone. Tessa began backing her cart toward the hallway. That was when she noticed the nightstand. The ring was gone. She blinked. She had set it there herself, not 5 minutes ago. She turned back to the room, and the man was standing completely still, his phone lowered, staring at something in his open palm. The ring. He must have picked it up on his way to the desk without even looking. Muscle memory, maybe. Tidying without thinking. Or maybe something else. His face had changed. That was the only way Tessa could describe it. A moment ago he had been tired and distracted. Now he was the kind of still that comes before something breaks. "Sir?" she said before she could stop herself. He looked up. His eyes were dark, and something in them had shifted so completely that Tessa felt, with the odd certainty of someone who has read thousands of strangers in thousands of rooms, that she was no longer looking at a man checking into a hotel. She was looking at someone who had just had the ground pulled out from under him. "Where did you find this?" he asked. His voice came out rough, like it had scraped something on the way up. "By the luggage rack," Tessa said. "It must have fallen. I was going to leave it on the nightstand for—" "Where exactly?" he asked. "Show me." It was an odd request. Tessa hesitated, then walked back into the room and pointed to the spot beside the rack. He crouched down and looked at the floor, at the small scuff in the marble where the ring had bounced. He pressed 2 fingers to the spot. Tessa was not the kind of person who pried. She had learned that lesson the hard way in her first year. A guest's private life was exactly that, and the moment you crossed into it uninvited, you lost something you couldn't get back. But something about the way this man was crouching on the floor of his $4,000 a night suite, pressing his fingers to a marble scuff like it was a wound, made her stay. "It's a beautiful ring," she said finally, because silence felt worse. He stood. He looked at the ring again. Then he looked at her and said something she didn't expect. "It belonged to my mother." Tessa didn't move. "She's been missing for 19 years, he said. "And this ring?" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "This ring has been missing with her." The lobby of the Ashford Grand was built to make people feel small in a pleasant way. 40-foot ceilings, a chandelier that had been imported from Vienna in 1927, floors of pale limestone that had been polished so many times they looked lit from within. Tessa had walked those floors 10,000 times and still thought they were the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen up close. She was standing on them now, outside the hotel manager's office, trying to remember what she had actually agreed to. The man's name, she'd learned from the front desk attendant who nearly tripped over herself making introductions, was Callum Ashford, as in the Ashford Grand. as in the family that had built this hotel in 1924 and still held the controlling interest in Ashford Properties, which owned 11 hotels across Canada and 4 more in the United Kingdom. "You work for me," Callum had said with a dryness that suggested he found this somewhat absurd. Technically, Tessa had agreed. "And you found my mother's ring." "I did." "Then I'd like to ask you some questions, if you're willing, starting with whether you've seen anyone in that suite besides me." That had been 20 minutes ago. Now she was sitting across from Callum in the hotel's private meeting room. Not the guest suite, not the lobby, the private room that most staff didn't know existed, and he was spreading photographs across the table like he was laying out evidence. "Anyone recognize her?" he asked, pushing a photograph toward Tessa. The woman in the photo was in her 40s, maybe younger. Dark hair, a wide smile, standing in front of a fountain somewhere in summer. She looked like someone who laughed easily and meant it. "I've never seen her," Tessa said honestly. "Her name is Vivian Ashford, my mother." Callum pulled the photo back. "She left 19 years ago. Publicly, the family said she'd had a breakdown, needed time away. She was placed in a private care facility outside the city." He paused. "Except when I finally got access to those records last year, there was no Vivian Ashford in their system. Not then, not ever." Tessa felt something cold settle in her chest. "Someone lied," Callum agreed. "About where she was, about whether she was there at all, about why she left." He looked at the ring, "And now her ring turns up in my hotel room. In a room I booked under a different name. A room I only decided to stay in last week. You think someone left it here for you to find?" He looked at her. "That thought crossed my mind, yes." Tessa looked at the ring, sitting in the center of the table between them. "Old gold, dark green stone, always yours on the inside." "Or," she said carefully, "someone else had it and lost it without meaning to." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Either way," he said, "someone else had it, and until last week I thought I was the only person in the world looking for her." He met her eyes. "Now I'm not so sure." The woman at the front desk, whose name tag said Dorinda, Guest Relations, gave Tessa a look when she returned to the housekeeping floor. It was the look that meant, "What exactly were you doing up there?" But Tessa had learned long ago that Dorinda's looks were best responded to with a pleasant smile and absolutely no information. She smiled. She gave no information. She went back to her cart. The problem was that she couldn't stop thinking about the ring. She knew this hotel. Not the way management knew it. The occupancy rates, the revenue per room, the corporate accounts that kept the books balanced. She knew it the way the building itself knew it. Which pipes sang in February. Which elevator smelled faintly of lavender no matter how many times maintenance checked the vents. Which rooms were requested again and again by guests who didn't explain why, only asked, with something careful in their voice, whether room 312 was available. She knew who came and went. Not perfectly, not like security did, but she had the kind of ambient knowledge that accumulated from years of being invisible in places where things happened. And she was fairly certain that someone had been in suite 1408 before Callum checked in. Not the previous registered guest, a convention attendee from Calgary who had left 3 days before Callum arrived. Someone after that. During the window between guests, when the room sat empty and housekeeping had already done the turnover clean. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She had seen a small scratch on the luggage rack that hadn't been there before, and a faint smell she couldn't place. Something like cedar and something else, something medicinal. She had noted it in the way she noted everything, quietly, without fuss, and filed it away. Now she was taking it back out. She found Callum the next morning in the hotel restaurant at a corner table, reading something on his laptop. He looked up when she approached and, to his credit, didn't seem surprised. "You have something to tell me," he said. "I might have something to tell you," Tessa corrected. "I want to be honest. I'm not sure it means anything." "Sit down." She sat. She told him about the scratch on the luggage rack, about the smell she couldn't place, about the timing, the 3-day window between guests when the room should have been empty and sealed. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "Cedar and something medicinal, yes. My mother used to wear a cedar-based perfume," he said, "and she was a nurse before she met my father. She kept eucalyptus oil in her bag, called it a professional habit." Tessa felt the hairs on her arms rise. Not a question, quiet but absolute. "I don't know that," Tessa said carefully. "I do." He closed his laptop, "Or she came here herself and she left the ring." He looked at Tessa. "She was trying to leave me a message. Why here? Why your hotel room? Because it's the one place she'd know I'd eventually be." He paused. "My grandmother died 8 months ago. The hotel transfers to me as sole heir on my 33rd birthday. which is 6 weeks from now. He looked out the window. Anyone who knew my family would know I'd have to come here. Tessa thought about what it would take to know that, to know the terms of an estate, to know which room a man would book under which name, to know the exact window to enter a hotel room, leave a ring, and disappear again. "Callum," she said, "who would want to keep your mother hidden?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, that's what I've been trying to figure out for a year." He ordered a second coffee. She stayed. The name came up 3 days later. Tessa wasn't looking for it. She was doing what she always did on Tuesday mornings, the deep clean of the executive floor, which required 2 staff members, a checklist that ran to 4 pages, and the particular patience of someone who doesn't mind doing important work without an audience. Her colleague, a quietly efficient woman named Paula, who had been at the Ashford Grand for even longer than Tessa, was changing the filters on the HVAC unit in the executive suite when she said, almost to herself, "Barton's up here again." Tessa looked up from the baseboards she was cleaning. "Who?" "Reginald Barton." Paula didn't look up from the filter. "He's on the board. Was here twice last week, came back this morning, using the executive suite like it's his own living room." Tessa set down her cloth. "What board?" "The hotel board, Ashford Properties." Paula finally looked up. "He's been here since before I started. Friend of the old man, the father. After the father died, Barton basically ran things until the grandmother took over." She wrinkled her nose. "I don't like him. He looks at staff like we're the furniture." Tessa was quiet. Then, "Paula, does Barton have access to empty guest suites between bookings?" Paula looked at her. "Why?" "I'm just wondering about the security protocols." Paula's expression said she didn't entirely believe that, but she was too professional to push. "Board members have executive floor access. Whether that extends to guest suites," she shrugged, "I'd have to check." That night, Tessa called Callum from the parking garage where the signal was better. "Reginald Barton," she said, silence on the other end. Then, "Say that again." She repeated it. Another silence, longer this time. When Callum spoke again, his voice had dropped to something she hadn't heard from him before. Not the controlled composure he wore like a second coat. Something underneath it. "Barton was my father's closest friend," he said. "He was at every family dinner. He carried my mother's bags at my parents' anniversary party. He was the one who told me, when I was 13 years old, that my mother had gone somewhere to get better." He paused. "He was the one who told me not to ask too many questions, that it would upset her recovery." Tessa pressed her back against the cold concrete of the parking garage wall. "And you believed him?" "I was 13, Callum said. "It wasn't a defense. It was a fact delivered without self-pity, which made it worse." "He's on the board," Tessa said. "He has access to the executive floor. And the hotel logs show he was here twice in the week before you checked in." "He was making sure I'd find the ring," Callum said slowly. Tessa frowned. "Or he was making sure you wouldn't." Another silence. This one stretched long enough that the parking garage felt very empty. "I need to think about this," Callum said. "So do I," Tessa said. And she meant it, because she had the uncomfortable realization standing in the concrete cold that she had become involved in something she hadn't asked to be involved in. She had found a ring, that was all. She had done her job, noted something, told the truth. And now she was standing in a parking garage at 9 o'clock at night, and the man on the other end of the phone, her employer technically, was very quiet in a way that felt like the held breath before something fell. "Tessa," Callum said. She was startled, faintly, to hear him use her name. She'd only given it to him once in passing. "Yes. Why are you helping me?" She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which she hadn't done until this moment. "Because someone was in that room," she said finally. "Someone who needed to leave a message and didn't know how, and nobody else noticed but me." She heard him exhale. "I'll be in the hotel tomorrow morning," he said. "Don't say anything to anyone tonight." "I wasn't going to," Tessa said. She hung up and looked at the concrete ceiling. Then she said, "To the parking garage in general. You couldn't have been a normal lost ring, could you?" The parking garage did not respond. She went home. The next morning arrived gray and close, the way October mornings in Toronto did when they meant business. Tessa was at the hotel by 6:30, which was earlier than her shift, but she had spent most of the night thinking and her apartment had started to feel very small. She was refilling the supply trolley when Dorinda from Guest Relations appeared around the corner, with an expression that Tessa had never seen on her before. Dorinda always had a look, the polite skepticism, the competitive appraisal, the professionally warm smile that reached about halfway to her eyes. She did not usually have the look she was wearing now, which was something close to alarm wearing a thin coat of composure. "Mr. Ashford is asking for you," Dorinda said. "In the private meeting room, thank you," Tessa said. "Tessa." Dorinda lowered her voice. "Reginald Barton is here." Tessa kept her face neutral. Okay, he arrived at 6 before opening practically. He went straight to the executive floor. Dorinda paused. He had a woman with him. Tessa set down the supply box very carefully. Describe her. Dorinda blinked at this. Older, 60s maybe, gray hair. She stopped. She looked confused, like she didn't quite know where she was. Tessa was already moving. The private meeting room was on the 2nd floor, tucked behind the conference suite and accessed by a door that looked like a wall panel unless you knew what to press. Callum was inside when Tessa arrived, and he was not alone. A man in his mid-60s sat across the table from Callum. He had the build of someone who had been larger once and was still carrying the memory of it. Wide shoulders, a certain heaviness in the way he took up space. His face was arranged in an expression of reasonable concern, the face of a man managing a situation. And beside him, in a chair that had been pulled slightly away from the table, sat a woman. She was in her 60s, gray hair, not styled. She wore a cardigan that was slightly too large for her, and her hands were folded in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who had been told, many times, that stillness was required. She was looking at the table. Then she looked up. She looked at Callum. And Callum, who had managed, in the 3 days Tessa had known him, to maintain an extraordinary degree of control over his own face, went completely still. "Mum," he said. Just that. One syllable. The woman's eyes filled. "Callum." Her voice was soft. It had the quality of someone who hadn't been listened to in a very long time and was no longer certain their voice carried. Reginald Barton stood up. "Now, before anyone gets emotional," he said, in the tone of a man who has used those exact words many times to prevent things he didn't want happening, "I think it's important to establish some context." "Sit down," Callum said. His voice was low. It was the kind of low that has weight behind it, the kind you could feel in the floor. Barton sat down. Tessa stayed near the door. Callum walked around the table and crouched in front of his mother's chair, which is what you do when you need someone to see your face and you don't want anything between you. He took her hand, she said. Then, "I'm so tired, Callum." "I know," he said. "I know. I'm here. I tried to leave the ring where you'd find it," she said. "Reggie was watching the room numbers. He was going to check which suite you booked, so I only had a small window. I had to be careful not to, Vivienne." Barton's voice sharpened. "We discussed this. You've been unwell, and the medication sometimes makes you feel things that aren't." "Don't." Callum didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Don't finish that sentence." Barton closed his mouth. Callum looked at his mother. "Who else knows you're here?" "Just Reggie. He brings me to appointments. He's controlled." She stopped, looked at her hands. "He's controlled where I live for a long time. Since your father died. He told me it was what your father wanted." "It wasn't," Callum said. "I know," Vivienne Ashford said. "I've known for years." She stopped again, looked at the door at Tessa with sudden focus. "You," she said, "you're the one who found it." Tessa said, "Yes. Did you know what it was?" "No," Tessa said honestly. "I just knew it was important." Vivienne looked at her for a moment with those eyes that had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Then she nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they've found the right word for something that didn't have one before. "Thank you," she said. What happened in the hours that followed was not simple, and it was not quiet. Callum called the family's solicitor before Barton could leave the room. The solicitor arrived by 9:30, a brisk woman named Adeyeze, who brought 2 colleagues and a briefcase that seemed to contain, among other things, documents Callum had apparently been preparing for some time. Financial records showing unauthorized access to Vivienne's personal estate. A paper trail built over 19 years of disbursements from accounts controlled solely by Reginald Barton. Letters, recovered with considerable effort from facilities Vivienne had moved through, documenting her requests to contact her son, requests that had been intercepted and never forwarded. Barton's reasonable concern face deteriorated through several stages. First it became indignant, then calculating. Then, when Adeyeze laid the last document on the table, a transfer of power of attorney signed, the original by Vivienne's own hand, revoking Barton's authority retroactively to the date of her first request to contact Callum, it became something smaller, something that didn't have a polite name. He was escorted out of the hotel by 2 people Tessa didn't recognize and later learned were from Callum's legal team. The lobby looked the same as it always did, the chandelier from Vienna, the limestone floors. The guests moving through without knowing that something had just broken open on the 2nd floor. Tessa stood at her cart in the corridor outside the private room and thought about the ring, the way it had fallen, the sound it made. Too small to mean anything except that she had heard it. The door opened and Callum came out. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for 19 years and had just put it down and wasn't sure yet what his posture was without it. Tessa recognized the feeling from the outside, the way you could see it in the shoulders, in the particular quality of tiredness that was actually relief. He stopped when he saw her. "She wants to stay in the hotel tonight," he said. "I told her she could have whatever suite she wanted. She asked for something with a view of the lake." He paused. "She said she hasn't seen the lake in a long time." Tessa said, "I know which room." "Of course you do." She almost smiled. "I'll go prepare it." She started to push her cart down the corridor. "Tessa." She stopped. Callum was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a clean category for. Not gratitude exactly, though that was there. Not the particular warmth of someone pretending not to be affected. Something more direct than either. "I know this isn't what you're supposed to do," he said. "I know you found a ring and ended up in the middle of something that had nothing to do with your job." "It had everything to do with my job," Tessa said. "I noticed something. I said something. That is the job. You could have put the ring on the nightstand and left." "I did put it on the nightstand," she said. "You picked it up." Something shifted in his face. Something that was, she thought, the beginning of a smile. It arrived the way the first real smile always arrives in people who don't smile easily, slowly, a little uncertain, like it's not sure of its welcome. "My grandmother left me this hotel," Callum said. "She left me the whole company, actually. I've spent the last year trying to figure out what to do with it." He glanced around the corridor, at the limestone and the quiet and the particular weight of a building that had outlasted most of what it had seen. "I think I know now." "What do you know?" Tessa asked. "That a place is only as good as the people who actually keep it." He looked at her. "I'm going to need someone who knows this building the way you do. Not to push a cart, Tessa. To help me run it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I have opinions about the HVAC on the executive floor. I expected you would. And the luggage racks in 1408 need to be replaced. The base is unstable." Noted. "And Paula, the woman I work with on Tuesdays, she should be on the management track. She's been here longer than anyone, and she notices things." "All right. And I'm going to need to think about your offer," Tessa said. "Because I've worked for this hotel for 12 years and I'd like to do this properly. Which means not saying yes in a corridor because I'm emotionally compromised by events." Callum laughed. It was a real one. It changed his whole face, the way real laughter does, the way you can't manufacture it no matter how controlled you otherwise are. "Fair enough," he said. Tessa pushed her cart down the corridor. She was almost at the elevator when she heard him behind her. "She's going to want to meet you properly, you know." "My mother." Tessa pressed the elevator button. "I know she'll probably ask you to stay for tea. I'll stay for tea. She talks a lot, once she feels safe." "Good," Tessa said. "She's been quiet long enough." The elevator arrived. She stepped in, the doors closed. She looked at her reflection in the brushed steel and thought about the ring, and the sound it made when it hit the floor, and how long it had been waiting to be found. 3 months later, a woman walked into the Ashford Grand on a Tuesday morning and stopped in the lobby to look up at the chandelier. She did this every time, with the expression of someone rediscovering something they had loved and lost and found again. Her name was Vivian Ashford, and she was learning, slowly, to be in the world again. Some days were easier than others. Some days she sat by the Lakeview window in room 312 and didn't speak much, and Tessa would bring her tea and sit with her without filling the silence, which was its own kind of language. Some days she came down to the lobby and talked to the staff with the careful warmth of someone who knows what it is to be overlooked, and those were the best days. Reginald Barton's case was before the courts. Adese had described it, with professional neutrality, as straightforward and extensive, which in legal terms Tessa understood to mean there is a great deal of evidence and very little he can plausibly deny. The hotel board had been restructured. Paula was on the management track, as promised, and had reacted to this information by saying, well, obviously, in a way that made Tessa feel she had been right about her from the beginning. Tessa herself had said yes to Callum's offer on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the events in the private meeting room, in a meeting that lasted 45 minutes and covered compensation, title, scope of responsibility, and, briefly but sincerely, the HVAC situation on the executive floor. She was still, technically, getting used to it, to having an office, to sitting on the other side of meetings, to the particular adjustment of being seen after so long of being known only to the building. On the Tuesday morning in question, Callum found her in the east corridor checking the repair work on the luggage rack in 1408. "It's done," she said without looking up. "They replaced the base. It's solid now. I can see that." You don't have to personally inspect every repair I flag, you know. You can trust me. I do trust you, he said. I came to find you for a different reason. Tessa stood up. He was holding something. A small envelope, the old-fashioned kind, sealed. My mother wrote you a letter, he said. She said she wanted to do it properly, that she wanted it on paper because, he paused. She said she wanted you to be able to keep it. Tessa took the envelope. She turned it over. On the front, in a handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven, like someone relearning how to hold a pen. For Tessa, who heard the small things, she looked at it for a moment. Are you going to read it? Callum asked. Later, she said. When I'm somewhere quiet. He nodded. He didn't push. That was one of the things she had come to understand about Callum Ashford in 3 months. He had a genuine patience under the composure, a willingness to let things arrive in their own time, which was rarer than it looked. They stood in Suite 1408 for a moment, in the quiet that had settled over the room now that it was just a room again. The lake was visible through the window, gray-green today, the October light beginning its annual retreat. I want to change the name, Callum said. Tessa looked at him. Of what? The suite. The executive floor suites all have designations that go back to my grandfather's time. Numbers and letters. I want to name them. He looked at the window. I want this one to be called something that means something. Tessa thought about it. Call it sunlight, she said. He looked at her. Because your mother couldn't see the lake for a long time, she said. And now she can. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right. He picked up the room service card from the desk, the one with the suite designation at the top, and crossed out the number with a pen from his pocket. He wrote sunlight in its place. It wasn't official. It wasn't a board decision or a design committee or a rebrand with a press release. It was just 2 people in a room, in a building that had outlasted nearly everything, making something mean something on a Tuesday morning in October. But some things start that way. Quietly, without an audience, just a sound too small to matter except to the person who hears it.